Okay, are we ready to go?
I think we are.
Well, hello everyone. It's good to see you on this post-election day. And you may have the election blues like I do, but I'm smiling and I'm glad to be here with you. I'm Martell Teasley, Dean and Professor of the College of Social Work at the fabulous University of Utah. I'm going to let my friend and colleague introduce herself before we get started.
Thank you so much, Martell. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here today. My name is Elizabeth Kronk Warner. I have the privilege of being Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah, and my pronouns are she and hers. And like Dean Teasley, we were bemoaning the fact that we haven't gotten much sleep since the election results started coming in. So we're excited to be here with you today and talking about these important topics. Dean Teasley?
Thank you. And so we're going today, and I feel really at home with Dean Martell Warner. And maybe we can take away the formalities a bit. And I'll just call her Elizabeth. She can call me Martell. We'll
Sounds
do that.
good.
I think this is like our third or fourth one. So we're getting more and more comfortable in doing this. And just really glad that you're here. We're going to talk about race and racism in children and kids and how do you talk about that with them. Tough topic, but it's something I do know a little bit about in terms of studying the socialization of children in my PhD program. And I was once the editor in chief of a magazine, a social work journal called Children in Schools. And so that subject broached quite a bit. And I'm going to actually borrow quite a bit from an editorial that I wrote one time. And it was called When the Summer Burns Red, What Will We Tell the Children?
Mhm.
And it's really about race and racism in children. And it came, ironically, after the death of Philando Castillo in Minnesota. And so I wrote that year. And of course, we've had subsequent tragedies. And so I interrupted the normal writing that I had that day and wrote about children and talking about this. And so I'll start by saying, talking about race and racism with children, whether we know it or not, our society will send messages to everyone, to children, about race and racism all the time. Now it's about age two, toddlers start to, understand shapes and figures, and then people of different hues and different colors. About age 3 and 4, they really start to know the difference between racial and ethnic groups. Later on, as kids go through elementary school, our society has a way of making people pick which groups they belong to, stating your identity in terms of who you are. And so then children through the socialization process, particularly starting in middle school, really get more of a socialization about race and who they are. And so just saying that, just in general, our society sending these messages. And so let's think about some of the messages that we send all the time, even though we don't know it. Think about cartoons and even some children's books and nursing rhymes. They're full of like death and despair. Like so Humpty Dumpty sat on the wall, and Humpty Dumpty had a great fall, and all the king's horses and all the king's men could not put Humpty together again. Tragic story, and we're telling that to kids. Old Mother Hubbard, Jack and Jill. I could go on and on. So we talk about these tragedies with children, although sometimes they don't seem permanent and they're not about humans. And then our children watch cartoons on Saturday morning, the movies, and they're full of people dying all the time, even in animation. And we have no problem with that in general. So some of us do. Part of the research says there that, particularly like in cartoons, that death is not permanent, and there's no explanation of it. So cartoon characters zap someone, knocks them out of space. You don't see them again. There's no discussion about that. There's no discussion of the tragic things that happen after that, whether the person had a family or anything. So that's okay for the movies, but we are sending those messages about death and dying to children. And so children at very small ages, in many ways don't understand death. Toddlers don't understand the permanency of death or the irreversibility of it, the non-functionality of it, and the universality of it. And so right around ages 3 and 4, we start to really understand that death can happen. And sometimes children will blame themselves if a loved one dies. And so they may say, uncle died and what happened to him? And you took him away. And they blame themselves. They may blame a parent because that's the only thing they know. They're not wired, they're not sophisticated enough to understand possibly disease processes or other types of things. And so death and dying is, really challenging. But on the subject of race, um, it depends on race and ethnicity in many ways in terms of who we are. I would say that we would start with, there's a slew of books. I saw one of the questions about books. Things are quite different today. We can go on Google or Amazon, and there's a cornucopia of books for children. And so we could look at early books about diversity in terms of who we are. One by C.M. Harris, What If We Were All the Same? And it's a book about children and diversity. So I would really start there to let children understand why we are different, why we have different hues and come from different places and have different cultural backgrounds. And then more so on to a discussion about race later. Now, for some families, for African American kids, we are in many ways, for one, we're like anyone else, but we're forced to talk about race because of some things that happens in our communities. So if we look at the homicide rate amongst Black men, if we look at extrajudicial killings by police in terms of Black children, Black men, then those are things that have to be explained. And there was a situation when I was in Texas where there was a killing, and a 12-year-old asked her mother about it and said, why does this keep happening? And she said, well, I don't know why it keeps happening, and could not explain it. Now, Arthur Kwame Brown basically says that we failed our children when they have to ask those questions, because we have to kind of bring them along. Excuse me, I said Kwame Brown. His name is Kwame Alexander. First name spelled Kwame, Kwame Alexander, and he writes children's books. And so he basically says if a 12-year-old is asking that question about the meaning of death and event, we've kind of failed them. And he wrote a short poem that he talked about, that he used in talking to children about race and death and dying. And it goes like this. It's called When, W-H-E-N. And it states, when the world is not so beautiful, the flowers waste water. The women can no longer find their song. The children refuse to play. There are no men to teach to love. The ground inside collapses. The coldest winter screams. The summer burns red. The sea is full of blues and the sky opens up. And so when I talk to my grandchildren, I talk like that. What if the birds don't sing anymore? In terms of getting to understand what death is, and talking about race and why we have this difference amongst us. Now, I will say that part of this provokes the culture wars piece about talking about issues about race. So if I really talk to my children about African American history, there's quite a few things that they're not taught in school. And I would imagine Dr. Dean Kronk Warner, Elizabeth, probably would have the same if she talked about Native American heritage with her children, what that really means. If we really talked about the true meaning of Thanksgiving and many of our holidays, maybe some people don't want our children to know that. So then we have challenges with what children are taught in school and what's taught in the home. And so a good parent, I just say, and parents in general, one of our responsibilities will be to understand what is being taught in the school system and how that coincides or different in terms of what's being taught in the home about race, ethnicity, gender, and diversity issues, and about issues in death and dying. We skirt over that a little bit. We're very keen about issues in terms of sexual orientation. And there's huge fights about what should we talk about with children about sexual orientation. But these other things, we don't talk about them so much, and we're not worried about them so much. So again, parents should be carefully interested and what the school is talking about in terms of race and ethnic relations, and as well as filling the blanks in at home. So parents are responsible for socializing their children about race and ethnicity. And parents are also responsible for countering or supporting or differing on the narratives sent about race and ethnicity in our society to children. Parents are also responsible about explaining events that take place in life that may, make children think about race or racism. So, for example, I grew up in an urban community in the 1960s in Cincinnati, Ohio, and the riots started. So I'm a little boy, about 7 or 8 years old, and there's a curfew in my community. And all of the older boys really turned militant. I didn't even know what the word militant meant at the time, but they turned very serious, and they told me I had to wear black to school. Okay. And one time I was out in front of my house playing, and the police drove by and said, "What are you doing out here?" And in my 7-year-old mind, I'm like, "Well, I'm playing in front of my house." He's like, "No, what are you doing outside?" And I'm looking at him like he's crazy because I'm playing in front of my house. And he says, "There's a curfew." Well, I didn't even know what the word curfew meant. And so I'm really befuddled. And then I hear the voice of my father, Martell, come in the house. And there's no explanation about this whatsoever. It's just come in the house. And so I'm very curious at the time of what's happening. Why is this happening in my neighborhood? Why did this policeman make me at 7 or 8 years old go in the house? I was just playing in front of the yard. And why did my parent not support me and make me come in? It wasn't even dark yet. And so again, we have a responsibility to talk to our children because the guys out in my neighborhood, they had a narrative for me, even at 7 years old. Okay. And so sometimes we don't want that to be the narrative. We want to make sure that we get a healthy narrative for our children. I'm going to stop right there. There's certainly a lot more to say.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I'm actually really excited because I believe since we had our last race and racism conversation, the University of Utah has adopted a new tribal land acknowledgement statement. So I wanted to start off kind of my introductory remarks by using our new statement, which I'm very excited about. So our statement says, "We acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many Indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and community outreach activities." So I'm excited to be able to start off my comments today with our new University of Utah statement. Before I jump into kind of our topic of the day, which is how to chat about race and racism with your children, certainly a topic that's near and dear to my heart as a mother, I did want to just, this is an ongoing dialogue about race and racism, I did want to point out something that has certainly been on my mind the past couple of days in relation to the election, and that is the demographic results of the vote. So I had a chance to pull the demographic information from the New York Times, and it's really striking to me how racialized this vote was. So the New York Times asked, "What is your racial or ethnic heritage?" and then did a breakdown of the percentage of people who fall into those categories who voted for President Trump versus Vice President Biden. And whites, people who identified as white, 57% voted for President Trump, 42% voted for Biden. People who identify as Black, 12% voted for President Trump, 87% voted for Biden. People who identify as Hispanic or Latino, 32% voted for President Trump, 66% voted for Biden. People who identify as Asian, 31% voted for President Trump, and 63% voted for Biden. And those who identify or fall into other categories, which I guess is me, 40% voted for Donald Trump and 58% voted for Biden. So just there we can see that these really are stark results where the majority of people who identify as white are voting for the president, whereas in all the other racialized categories, the majority of people voted for Biden, according to the New York Times. And then you can see that even more starkly when the New York Times asked, are you white or non-white? And those who identified as non-white, 72% voted for Biden. And then you get into, they asked, what is your gender and racial or ethnic heritage? And you really start when you break it out by, for example, Black men and Black women. For example, Black women, 91% voted for Biden. And only 8% for President Trump. 70% of Latino women voted for Biden and 28% voted for Trump versus people who identify as white men, 58% voted for President Trump and 40% voted for Biden. So as we think about race and racism, that to me they're really interesting statistics because we seem to have strong schisms based on racial lines. And so there are some who fear that once we get a final decision on the election, which could come in the next couple of days, I guess it's somewhat up in the air when we'll actually get the final decision, that could result in some race-related protests. And so this is something that's definitely on my mind, is how divided we seem to be as a country among race lines and how we're viewing politics. And the results of this election just tell me that is only further entrenching. I mean, those differences are pretty stark. I don't think we've seen such strong differences in a presidential election. At least certainly I can't remember during my lifetime. And so it seems like our racialized differences as a country are entrenching. And so that makes these conversations about race and racism and how we talk to our children, right, who are the next generation, that much more important. So I found those kind of demographics very interesting from this election. But going to our specific topic, again, how do we talk about race and racism with our children? I am not the professional expert that Martell is, but this is something that I have certainly been thinking about a lot as a mother, and thinking about how to handle it with my own child who, like me, is phenotypically white presenting, but is a citizen of a tribe. And so what that means for how he interacts with the world and how the world interacts with him. I think the most important thing, as I've looked into the research, and certainly my husband, who has a PhD in education, has really been leading the way in this in my family, so I want to acknowledge him. But we simply have to talk about race. I think sometimes when I chat with other parents, there's this feeling of, well, children are too innocent, or they're too sensitive, or this myth that children don't see race. That's all untrue. So there is this need to actively talk about it because they're not these innocent, race-blind creatures that we seem to think they are. Kids are being socialized at a very early age around race. And Martell already mentioned some of these statistics, but I'll just hit them again to kind of drive it home. So by 6 months, kids can make out racial differences between individuals. So at 6 months, your child or children are identifying race. By ages 2 to 4, your child is internalizing racial bias. And by age 12, many children will become set in their beliefs for the rest of their lifetime. So that's kind of shocking at how early that happens, but it also means that we as parents and as educators have a solid decade, if not more, to make a difference and to start having these conversations. And so I think that's really helpful for us to think about how we're going to do it. So how do we talk to our kids about race and racism? So first, I think it's important to talk to them and to acknowledge it. And I'll use an example of my 3-year-old son. So he was at a playground one day, and there was a phenotypically white-looking boy that was there when we first got there, and he was really excited to play with that boy and played, and they were having a good time. And then that boy left, and then there was a lull, and then what appeared to be a Latinx family came. And there were several kids, but there were kids that looked to be his same age. And rather than kind of jumping in and playing with them, my son really held back, didn't seem to engage as much. And as I watched as a mother, that really disconcerted me, because there was a skin difference, a skin tone difference in the boys. And from my perspective, that was the only difference that I could see. The Latinx children seemed just as excited to play as the phenotypically white boy had seemed to play. And so when we got into the car to leave, I asked my son about it. I said, I noticed you seemed really excited to play with the phenotypically white boy, but then when this other family came, you didn't seem as excited to play. I said, did you notice the color difference of the boys? And my son said, yes. And I said, well, is that the reason why you didn't want to play with these other children? And he said, yes. And it's a little hard to know, sometimes I think my son says things just to kind of egg me on a little bit. And that could have been a piece of it. But he did say that was a reason. And so I had to take him at his word. And so after that, we spent kind of the rest of the day talking about how we shouldn't decide who we're going to play with based on the color of their skin, and why as a family we did not value that, and we valued an anti-racist community. And of course, for me, as somebody who spent a lot of time working on anti-racism, that was of course a hard pill to swallow, that maybe my son was making decisions on who he was going to play with based on skin tone. But I think that was a really important conversation to have. Next, so not only do you talk about them, and it doesn't have to be a perfect conversation. It can just be, I see this and I acknowledge this, let's talk about it. You have to confront your own bias. You have to model how you want your children to respond. So your children are actively watching you in everything you do. And so anytime you encounter a situation like that, I think it's really important for us as parents to stop and to think. There's a lot of research that shows that the best way to confront implicit bias, which we all have implicit bias, is by being more deliberative and intentional. The best way that we can disrupt implicit bias is to slow down. So when you find yourself as a role model to your child in a situation that potentially involves race or interracial communications, slow down. Just think about how you want to respond. Think about the fact that your child is watching you, and really try to model that anti-racist behavior. Next, encourage your children to challenge racial stereotypes and racial bias. If they call it out or if they raise it, applaud them and congratulate them for their awareness and for their willingness to call it out. Of course, that means that you also have to call it out, which sometimes can be very uncomfortable. I think a lot of times in society, we're taught that it's not nice to talk about race. It's not nice to call out somebody's potential racism. And so certainly that's how I was socialized as a woman. And so that can be very awkward at times, but I think it's really important to do that. And so that leads to the question of how do we confront our own racial biases? If we're going to model this and engage in this conversation for our children, how do we do it ourselves? And so obviously that means trying to be very intentional and becoming that role model. Work on having a culturally diverse network. That's something I myself have been working on. So given that I'm a citizen of a tribe, I have a lot of friends who are also tribal citizens, but not necessarily in other communities. And so that's something that I've been very much aware of and trying to make up for that discrepancy for my son. Travel. expose, obviously that's not possible right now, but when we can travel again, travel if you have the opportunity, even if that means you just go to different communities here within Utah. So for example, in Salt Lake City, we're really blessed to have rich communities in the Latinx community, refugee communities, immigrant communities, Asian communities. We have really some wonderful resources just here in Utah. So take advantage of that. Tribes here in Utah, expose your children to those different communities and narratives, and also get involved. Don't be afraid to get involved, whether it's school, your church, get involved in politics, talk about politics, talk about why these issues are important to different communities. That's really important to engage in. And don't be afraid, even if all you feel comfortable doing is asking questions, it's really important to do that. So those are just some thoughts on how we can talk to our students, and then what we can do as parents to really role model for our children. So I'll turn it back over to Martell. I think we got a couple of questions ahead of time that we'll get a shot at providing answers to, and then maybe we can go to Q&A for anybody who's currently attending. Martell?
Sure. Thank you, Elizabeth, and well spoken. I see it. I'll start with some of the questions here. One says, a suggestion being made about how to teach children to have positive perspectives on POC other than one's own is to socialize with a diverse group living in a small rural community. Our family only had that opportunity with white and Latinx people. How does one make up for this lack, a type of opportunity? That's really tough, and that's a very good question. To be frank with you, I've had African Americans particularly talk about that to me here in Utah in terms of having their children socialized in school and not having them around other quote unquote minoritized children or children of color. And that's really tough. One, I think Elizabeth mentioned traveling. That's, if you can, get out, take vacations other way, drive so that you can see the world. I mean, driving across the country is one of the best things I ever did. Everyone can't do that, but just traveling from state to state. And now, the internet provides a lot of opportunity for us to look at other cultures. I met a guy who was an expert on Japan once and had never been to Japan. It was all about what he read and what he found on the internet. And I have visited many places and talked to people, particularly on the African continent, and understood quite a bit more about their history than they do from my own readings. So we can do quite a bit, and we can imagine quite a few things through the technology that we have. And that's no panacea. That doesn't cure it, but it is an opportunity. The internet provides an opportunity for the window to the world. So while we demonize media a lot in terms of the challenges with it, and we hear all these bad things about it, it actually can be a very good learning tool. So I would really suggest PBS. It's really good for children. It's been around for a long time. They put Sesame Street now on HBO, so for families that have that. But those provide opportunities for children to kind of see the world through media. Traveling is a good thing. And then having friends, as Elizabeth said, from other ethnic groups, you have to really model the behavior. So I could, my father actually used to smoke he doesn't smoke anymore. He smoked 3 packs of cigarettes a day. And when he found that I was smoking at 16, he asked me where I learned that from. So wasn't too hard to, get the answer to that. So our children are really modeling our behaviors in terms of what they see us do. What types of friends? Are there slurs made? Is there open bias about racial issues, gender issues, ethnic groups? What types of jokes are allowed in our homes? Those types of things. All those are, in my own immediate extended family, there was a lot of what I used to call kitchen table talk, where the men got paid on Friday, and I'm generalizing here, women work too, but they would all come to my grandmother's house on Fridays and sit around and have some drinks. And there was lots of misinformation put out there, and I was absorbing a lot of it. We have to be careful about those types of things because children are listening. And it was later on that I had to defeat some of that within myself. I will say one last thing before I turn it back over to Elizabeth, and there are plenty more questions in terms of socializing children. You do want to do this as early as possible because once someone becomes a teenager, an adult, it's really hard to try to disrupt thinking that's normalized. You know, it would be really hard for somebody to tell me that I'm not an African American now, and I just may not even believe them. And if you can imagine things that children are exposed to that we don't talk to them about, that they find out later are different. So I remember talking to a person here at the college about Abraham Lincoln and freeing the slaves, and I told them the real story around Abraham Lincoln and what his intent was in terms of writing the Emancipation Proclamation. And this was a 30-something-year-old person who said to me, I never knew that. And then really, you know, I'm a dean, I'm a professor, but then they had to go check the information out for themselves. Well, they should. The next time they saw me, they go, I actually pulled up some books. What you're saying was right. You know, so what I did, I ended up disrupting the way they thought about things. That was that person. Some other person may have thought, oh, well, he's just one of these liberals and has this alternative way of thinking without examining things. And I say that to say that I really sometimes, in terms of talking about race and racism, there's a lot of drive-by debate where people want these real solid answers very quickly. I'm glad we have this hour to talk to you, and I'm glad we do it over time. I'm glad we can suggest some books, but it's for people to do homework on these types of things, studying, examining racism, working through things with your children, and not being afraid to be wrong about race. That, you know, I have still, I still have lots of stereotypes in me about race and racism that came forth through my socialization process. And I will be forever trying to get them out of me. And so I have to admit that to myself. It would be very healthy if we can admit to our children and our young ones and our families that we're wrong and we have problematic ideals about race and racism. I'll stop right there and turn it over to Elizabeth.
Martell, I was just thinking as you're talking about if people don't take anything else from today's discussion, I thought what you just said of don't be afraid to be wrong about race is the thing to take away. Because the reality is none of us are perfect. None of us have lived every experience. All of us have implicit bias. We're all going to make mistakes. I could tell you numerous stories of mistakes I certainly have made over the years. And I just, if you let that fear of being wrong or making a mistake handicap you, you'll just never be able to engage in this conversation. So I just thought that was so brilliant. So thank you for sharing with that. So a couple of questions that we got ahead of time that I thought I would hit on that kind of go over the same theme again and again and again. And first was this example of we want to engage in this work. We want to have these conversations with our children. How do we do it? And in particular, so for example, what books would be appropriate for a 9-year-old to discuss systemic racism and oppression? There are 2 great websites that I encourage you to check out. So the first is a website called Diverse Book. So, sorry, it's actually called We Need Diverse Book. So if you just Google We Need Diverse Book, there's a whole website. You can get on their email list. There are resources for parents, and it can really help you match you with that cornucopia of books that Martell mentioned, which is so true, with where your child is. So they have resources kind of based on the age of your child. So that is an excellent resource. Another great resource is Cooperative Book Center, which is at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So that's another great one that I encourage you to check out in terms of saying, here are the books that are available and here are the books that are a good match for where your child is, kind of based on age. So two great resources for those of you who want to help to want to find diverse books are We Need Diverse Book, and then the Cooperative Book Center of the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And again, I'm sure also probably if you go to your local library, they'll probably have librarians who'll be able to help you with finding diverse resources. But those are two great resources online. The other kind of set of questions that we got a lot of questions around is, how do we have this frequency of discussion? Should it be proactive? Should we let children lead the way? When they have questions, should we check in? And the answer is yes, yes to all of it. It's kind of a mix. And one of the things that you'll see in the literature around this issue is really this need to create a safe space. And I will use that term safe in this context, although we've talked about in other examples of how maybe safe space isn't the right term anymore. But in this context, I think it is, because you want to talk about this topic so often that your children feel comfortable raising it and won't feel like they'll get it wrong or they'll get criticized if they ask you a question. And so if you don't start raising it and bringing this up, then they won't. So I think in many ways, you'll have to lead out and you'll have to check in. And hopefully over time, you'll create and foster this environment within your family where they feel really comfortable in raising questions that they may have and might ask. So I think the answer is yes, you do all those things. So then how do you talk about it if you're just kind of raising this issue of race? How does that come up? And I think there's some ways to start that conversation if there's not necessarily a catalyst to talk about it. So if you have older children, certainly this recent election, I think, is definitely a catalyst to talk about it and how people are voting. But otherwise, I think you can start the conversation by framing it around your family's values and definitions. So talking about what is racism? What do we mean when we say that somebody is racist, or we talk about systemic racism? What is discrimination? Talk about the fact that we all discriminate. We use discrimination as a way of making judgments. And so what does that mean? That discrimination is normal in the sense that we all use it, but sometimes it can be bad if we use it in ways that result in racism. And then talk about your values as a family. Why do we value anti-racism? Why is this important to us as a family? Why do we want to engage in these conversations? And I think that's really nice because it also goes towards this discussion of kind of creating that community and that environment within your own family so that everyone feels comfortable raising these questions. And then, when your children do raise these issues, affirm them, like, oh, that's great. For example, you sometimes in the literature, you'll see stories of like the child who yells out in a grocery store, oh, there's a Black person. And the mom or dad who responds of, oh, no, don't, oh, I'm so sorry. Don't talk about race. And, rather than kind of poo-pooing it and saying this isn't something we should acknowledge or talk about, saying, oh, well, yes, we have, isn't it wonderful that there are so many different people in the world, and you can kind of affirm it rather than trying to get the child to not talk about it or to ignore it. So just think about how you're going to respond to those situations, and it might feel awkward, it might feel uncomfortable, but remember, as Martell said, they're watching you. And so how you're responding is really going to impact how they respond, and they're going to start to internalize those beliefs about race by 12, and you might not be able to change it after that. So it's really important that we do this work early on. Martell?
Well, I got froze out there just for a minute, so I didn't hear the last part of that, but I'll pick up from there. I just wanted
assume it was brilliant. Just assume
Well,
brilliant.
Well, a couple of things you talked about in terms of a values discussion, and there are differences. People eat different things for breakfast, lunch. We have holidays that come up. I worked in the school, and it was really funny in Richmond, Virginia, and there were children of Asian descent. They were Vietnamese, and they wouldn't eat the lunch that the cafeteria, and so they called all the people, social workers, and we thought that people thought the children were being abused. And it was a very simple thing. The children wanted rice. They didn't want French fries. They didn't want potato. They wanted rice. And so we put rice on the menu. But all of our presuppositions about children being treated bad, uh, indifferences. But I do think my point there is those are opportunities of why they eat rice and why other people eat French fries and why people eat potatoes and why people cook their turkeys this way, et cetera, et cetera. Those are all opportunities for children to learn because they have to learn what one of my mentors called the why. It's not just why, but why. So you really have to get to what's really going on. And that's why you got to be able to have these conversations with your children all the time and create that space so that you're not this big, tall, all-encompassing parent, but somebody that can come down to their level and that they're not afraid to ask questions of you. So again, as I said earlier, children are already always gaining through the socialization process instances and messages about race and racism. And when we do not talk to them and they gain this sort of consciousness from external to the home, sometimes they can become very mad and angry. And psychologist William Cross calls it pulling the rug out from under you. So let's just say if I grew up as a kid, and when I was talking to you earlier about that situation during the civil rights movement, growing up in the 60s, well, you can imagine what that did for me in terms of curiosity. And so when I became a teenager, I started reading all these books about the civil rights movement, and it all started to fit. And then I was looking at my parents like, why didn't you tell me about this stuff? So I was a little angry at them. Not internally, not that I wanted to run away or anything, but I was angry. And then I realized later on that they were trying to protect me. They were trying to keep me as innocent as possible. Now, in terms of rearing my own children, my understanding of protecting them was to expose them to these things early. Children can take on a lot more than we think sometimes. So we're not really overburdening them. If we have the right language, we read books that are age appropriate to them. We introduce concepts to them that they can engage in based on their cognitive development, and they'll be fine. But my one point I want to raise here is that not talking about it, not having some understanding of why there's differences amongst groups in the socialization process leaves one with a sense of curiosity. And sometimes society answers those unanswered questions in ways we want or don't want. So we really don't want to leave that to happenstance in terms of our children. And so it's the responsibility of parents to make sure that children understand certain things. And I will say this is a very daunting task. I'm an African American. I have 4 children. I've lived in middle class neighborhoods. My children have been in diverse school settings. My home is rather Afrocentric, but then my children still have challenges understanding racism. Even though we talk about that, even though we read books, we read the Coretta Scott King series about the civil rights movement, and they still struggle with that. Mainly because at a certain point, they don't spend a lot of time with me. Once they become adolescents, they go to school, they spend a lot of time amongst their peers and they're socialized through that. So it's really a very daunting task. So as Afrocentric as I am, as pro-Black as I am, as responsible for understanding my own culture as I am, there's still gaps. I just want to make that point. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so true. I really relate to that. as somebody who initially, very early on in my life, was on the reservation, but since then I've lived largely in urban communities. And so there's definitely gaps in my experience as well. So I definitely relate to that as well. And I will mention, we can continue answering these questions we got ahead of time, but if anybody has any questions that they want to add to or want us to address or share our thoughts with, we are more than happy to get involved. So one question that we received goes around how to get involved with schools and kind of what is the expectation of schools. And I share Martell's opinion that parents bear a significant responsibility here. And I don't think that we can say, oh, we'll leave it to the teachers, because one of the questions that we got was, how are teachers trained on these issues? And so I did a little bit of digging into this, and by did a little bit of digging into this, I asked my husband who supervises student teachers, so he's familiar. So the credit goes to him. But I asked him that, and he shared that most teacher education programs do require a multicultural education course, but the content and the depth of those courses differs heavily from program to program. So while it's likely that your child's teacher will probably have had some exposure to a multicultural education class, you do not know the depth or how helpful that class was. So I think to rely on schools and say, oh, schools are going to accomplish this would be short-sighted. So how do you get involved with schools? So first of all, from my own experience, I'll say that I personally have just jumped in. So I've mentioned that I'm a citizen of a tribe. Indian history and culture is very important to me. November is Native American Heritage Month. Happy Native American Heritage Month, everybody. So I was very concerned about what my son was being taught at school, especially around this period between Halloween and Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, to be completely honest, is kind of my least favorite couple of weeks of the year, just because the possibility for offensive stereotypes or statements is very, very high during this period of time. And so I was concerned about what was going on in the classroom. And I would like to say that I approached the teachers humbly. I didn't want to assume that they were doing anything wrong or that they didn't have a plan, but I reached out and said, you know, I'm a citizen of a tribe, Indian issues and history are very important to me. Can you share with me what's being taught? Is there anything I can contribute? And the teachers were very responsive to that. And we had a dialogue back and forth of what I could do to help. And so ultimately we landed at a place where I was able to bring in some University of Utah students in to do some dances and drumming, and then to talk to the preschoolers about what that was and why it was culturally significant. And then we also shared, we had a book about powwows and dancing that we shared with the children as well. And so that was all through collaboration with the teachers, not assuming the worst of teachers, and having that conversation. And so I would encourage you just to jump in and to start that dialogue. There was a question about wanting to know more specifics about the best way for parents to approach schools, the teacher, the principal, PTA, someone else, what is likely to be effective. You know, my own personal experience, I think starting with the teachers, a great place to start and having that conversation. If you are really concerned about what's being taught, or if you're not happy with how the teacher is responding to any concerns or issues you might be raising, then absolutely the principal is a great place to go to have those conversations. And also get involved in the PTA if you have time, because that's a great way of influencing the curriculum as well. And show up to school board meetings. You know, school boards have public meetings on a regular basis. So this was something that I was engaged in my former school district. Is even though my son was not yet to high school, there were pretty strong learning differences and test score differences between different races for the local high school that my son would eventually be going to. And I was very concerned about that. And so just showing up at the school board meeting and expressing those concerns and seeing what the response is. And if you need to kind of take it to the next level where you organize parents around these things, you can. But I encourage you to, as an entry point, to have those like just respectful, humble conversations with the teachers, trying to understand what their curriculum is. What is your lesson plan around this issue? Martin Luther King Day is coming up in January. What is your lesson plan for that week? And they should have a lesson plan. And so just asking them to go over that with you, things like that, I think are really helpful. So I personally have always started with the teachers and have found that helpful in my experience. So I encourage others to do the same. Martell, any thoughts on that, how to interact with schools?
Couldn't agree more. Jumping in there is really good. Teachers are educated on how to teach the subject matter. They're not historians, they're not race historians. And so what research on professional development that Elizabeth talked about in terms of educators, what it says, those courses that they take on multiculturalism, what it really does is really just make them aware of some of their own biases. And that really doesn't get to the knowledge that they need to impart to students. And so that's quite a different, but I really love the kind of gentle way of jumping in. You don't want to upset the apple cart, but if you're approaching teachers and asking what the curriculum's about, what are they doing on certain days, and it's another way of letting them know that you are the parent are watching what's going on. This is Mrs. or Mr. So-and-so's boy or girl, and they're going to say something about this. And so you kind of put that bug there. I had a similar story told to me recently here in Salt Lake City from an African-American parent who has had such conversations about race and race with her child who is in high school, who called the mother and said, the teacher's really trying, but this is some really biased stuff that we're being taught. It's quite different than the things we've talked about at home. And as a parent, the parent reached out to the teacher and they were in dialogue. The teacher is very grateful and she's working with the teacher now on some issues. I mean, the teacher knows how to teach, but this is some of the literature you need to look at while you're teaching about this subject matter. So it turns out to be a real nice story, but the snickering, the not getting involved, and even small things I would say, you should say something about. So for example, my daughter was in the 4th grade and wanted to do a history project on an African-American. The teacher told her, there is no African-Americans we don't really know about, so you can't really add anything new to our history project. Yes, of course, I introduced the teacher to some different people in African-American history. I actually worked with her and my daughter. My daughter actually won the history prize that year. And the teacher was totally fluxed she did not understand anything about the person that we mentioned, who was Dr. John Henry Clark. Her ideal about African-Americans was Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, maybe Betty Chavez, Dr. King's wife, Rosa Parks. It was all the more traditionally glorized people. But please remember, there are lots of people that have done miraculous things. I was talking to a group of students last week about voting, and one made the notion of why should we vote? Nothing's going to change. I don't believe in any party. And I proceeded to tell the person who was African-American about the history of African-Americans in voting. There's many people who have sacrificed their lives so that we could stand in voting lines. Many people that are not in our history books that were killed. And so that then, what I said to the person is you have a moral obligation to understand this history and then make this decision based on that. So if you still don't want to vote, make sure you understand this history first. But I couldn't agree more with the jumping in. Again, we are responsible. Our children are vestiges of us. One of the analogies I always give is if we see a child who's been sucking their finger and their teeth is bucked because of that, which we don't really see anymore. very little. Braces are a great thing. But we can't say, oh, we don't know what happened. We know what happened if that's our child, if their teeth got bucked. We let them suck their thumb too long. Okay. And so if our children grow up and they do not understand race, diversity, gender issues, we can't look at them and say, oh, what happened? We have to look at ourselves in terms of what we did in our home, in terms of our responsibilities to our children and our responsibilities in our school systems. And so if the wrong thing is taking place within your school, I would agree with Elizabeth, get involved with the PTA, get involved with the school board. I've actually had to do that myself. And that can be a tough hold for parents in terms of particularly minoritized children, in terms of dealing with school. One of the toughest things of dealing with, particularly I will say, as an African American, has been the mainstream school system in terms of how my children socialize. Okay, Elizabeth, I'll stop right there.
I was just thinking as you're talking too, oftentimes one of the questions we regularly get is, how can I help? And I think that's a great example, because not expecting or asking, whether explicitly or implicitly, for the minority members of your school population to carry that burden and lead the way. So if you recognize, again, using my example of MLK Day, that nothing's being done around MLK Day, and you're not a diverse person, if you can lead out on that and raise those concerns, that's really helpful too, to not always be putting it upon racialized communities and minority communities to always have to lead out. And so if you're thinking about how can I help, that is always a great way, is not asking those communities to constantly lead out. Well, I see our time is running short, but there are just a couple of other categories of questions that we got over and over again. So one common question is, what is a good age to start talking to kids about race? Pretty much as soon as they're born. I mean, as we mentioned earlier, they can notice racial differences by 6 months. So by 6 months, your child has internalized Black and white and brown, and they've noticed those differences. And so obviously you're not having an intellectual conversation with them at 6 months, but being very much aware of what you're modeling in your own home. Do you have people of other backgrounds and other races coming in? Because they will notice that. So it is never, ever, ever too early to start talking about race. And also the other thing is, how do you, kind of these questions of how do you do it? There's no perfect way. The only thing you can really do is jump in and try. It goes back to what Martell said earlier. You can't let a fear of getting it wrong stop you from engaging. Because oftentimes, and there's so many great quotes about it. Of course, right now I can't think of one. There's like but silence is one of the biggest obstacles to this work. It's people who are uncomfortable talking about race and racism because, it's an unpleasant topic. It's not nice to talk about it. Or they don't want to suggest that somebody's racist. Silence is there's the quotes about silence is the tool of the oppressor. If you're silenced, it's the same as being engaged in racism. So please take it from us. You don't have to be perfect. I'm sure we could spend an hour telling you stories of how many mistakes we've made in our careers when it comes to discussions of race and racism. But just try, and just start in a place that's comfortable for you. And that's all you can really do. And just trying to have those conversations and just talk to your kids about it. And it'll work. You'll do a great job. I have every confidence you will. So Martell, any closing thoughts? I see that we're just about out of time.
Well, it's been a great conversation. We'll come back at you again. I hope you've enjoyed this. I always learn something. I hope you did. And as Dr. John Henry Clark said, the best time to start tomorrow's work is today.
Oh, I love that. Thank you, everyone. Have a great week.